All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to get right into it. Tonight we have a special work session. We're meeting with Union Studios for a continuation of our discussion on affordable housing options related to our vacant town properties, South Road School, Wakefield School, and the Oliver Watson property. Before we get right into it, hear from the consultants, I'm going to turn it over to Town Manager Jim Manning. Jim, go ahead.
Thank you, Council President. So as you stated, this is the South Kingston Affordable Housing Initiative that we'll be discussing tonight. And first and foremost, I want to thank everyone for attending. It's nice to see quite a few people in the crowd here. This is the second of two planned workshops by the Town Council. And the first was held on January 29th of 2025. And the team that is here, Union Studios, Peregrine Group, and the Planning Department, has worked, over the past 6 months, have worked to refine conceptual plans and gather input from the community for this important initiative. I would like to add, for the members that are here, that affordable housing is one of the top priorities in town as set by the Town Council, and we're striving to get to a whole new level with this. So there were 4 meetings and workshops that were held with stakeholders prior to this, one at each location, Oliver Watson, South Road School, Wakefield Elementary, Oliver Watson was held here, and then the 4th one was for the boards and commissions that attended. In addition, the EDC, the Planning Board, the Rec Commission, Planning Board all participated in a survey and a site analysis exercise with the consultants. I'd like to note that just today, if you've watched the news and you've heard the sound bites on TV, the radio, everything, the Governor McKee, and the Rhode Island Department of Housing just released a report that is entitled Housing 2030. And in that report, they stated South Kingston should construct 477 new housing units in the next 5 years with 72 affordable units. And that might seem like a lofty goal to a lot of people, but we're well on our way now to achieve that goal with some of the projects we've been working on. So once again, I want to thank all the boards and commissioners who participated in this process. And I'd like to introduce Jeremy Lake, the principal with Union Studio from Providence, and Eric Bush, the managing partner of the Peregrine Group, and Jamie Rabbit from our planning department. So Jamie, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manning. I don't think there's much more I can add since Jim really set the table tonight of why we're here, why this is important. So I'm not going to take up any more time, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy Lake from Union. Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Council. Nice to see you guys again. So as Jim pointed out, we were in front of you guys a little bit ago, sharing with you our progress, what we had been talking through with the community. Reboot is required. How about we don't reboot now? Perfect. We came before you guys last time. We shared sort of where we were at, some of the various options we'd been talking through. Those have been sort of refined and adapted over time. And again, all this is just meant to be an illustrative exercise to give you guys some understanding of what might be feasible here. I just want to make clear the goal was never this will be the plan, it's decided, and for here forth we will move forward. It really is trying to serve as an exercise to help everybody wrap their heads around what's really possible here, what might not be possible here. Ultimately, to serve you guys is to help you serve as a basis for an RFP for finding development partners to help make it a reality. So what we wanted to do was come back to you guys with the feedback we received from you last time. You may remember, and I'll go through it, we shared 3 or 4 schemes for each of the sites, and we were really trying to get down to what was a nice sort of, think of the Goldilocks approach. One was too hot, one was too cold, what feels just right, or at least is a good starting point for these sorts of conversations. And that's really what we're here to talk about tonight. So we'll go through each of the sites one by one. First, we're going to start with the South Road School site. As we've done all along, we've started by sharing, this is the existing conditions, the GIS map. One thing I began to realize is that the GIS map finds, these properties on their worst day, where there's no leaves in the trees and it looks like a desert moonscape and it's a little bit depressing. So I also went ahead and found a nicer image on Google where you can actually see that there are trees. There is a canopy out here. I thought it was just useful to not look so bleak every time we started talking about this. I think one of the important things that we want to talk about with the South Road School site that some of our previous schemes kind of cropped off, the fact that there is a whole park that is just beyond to the east of here. There's a big parking area. There's a lot of public access over there. And that connection through the site is something that came up a few times. So we wanted to make sure we were showing enough of the context to be able to see that and understand that. When we were here with you guys last time, these were the three schemes that we shared. We had a scheme on the top there that had a large multifamily building, and then we had two schemes that were really trying to break it down more to the scale of a neighborhood. The one on the left was showing a bunch of individual three-bedroom cottages. The one on the right showed the potential of maybe doing some triplexes to get a little bit more density on the site. And I believe these were ranging from, the numbers are too tiny to read, but I think it was something like 46 units on the one on the left and 56 units on the one on the right. And in talking it through with you guys, the feedback that we got from you and in subsequent conversations with town staff were that it probably wants to be something that's like a hybrid of options B and C. Primarily cottages, but open to the idea of some duplexes that might help us get a little bit of variety. And we also talked about how it should probably be a mix of 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units. So one thought we had was maybe the cottages are 3 bedrooms and the duplexes are 2 bedrooms. But again, it was just trying to illustrate the idea of there being a little bit of variety built into this. There was feedback that we had gotten all through the process. Folks were a little bit nervous about the first couple cottages that were just off of South Road. It'd be nice if they were sort of pulled back a little bit further, even though some of the adjacent homes are pretty close to South Road, that we don't need to push that here. So we tried to look at that. The point I made earlier, making sure that there's a clear pathway through the site back to the park that's beyond. To consider how we might think about access to the sled hill, that juncture where you just get beyond the neighborhood is right where the grades drop off, and a lot of people talked about using that as a sled hill. So how do we want to make sure that that's still accessible to everyone? And I also just threw in here, Eric will talk a lot more about some of these items when he gets up, but I think the conversation around this site was a real preference for homeownership to the degree that that could work out, that this was a site where that felt like the appropriate approach. So with all that feedback in mind, this was the revised scheme that we wanted to talk through tonight. So first and foremost, you can see we pulled the first couple cottages off of the front. So the first couple homes are probably something like 150 feet back from the roadway. And another thing that we did as a result was we reconfigured that green space at the front to be more linear and sort of a square. And one of the real benefits of that was it also let us rethink how the entry roads were coming in. So on the southern end, we have an access that's at the current curb cut that's out there today leading into the school. But on the northern portion, one thing we did is we shifted it up so it's actually in alignment with Chestnut Hill Road. And it's a minor shift, but I think conceptually it will make a big difference for folks that really feels like an extension of Chestnut Hill Road, that it's meant to be public and accessible for folks to come through. Instead of it feeling like you kind of have to figure out your way through the site, we think just making that seem so much more direct and connected would be really beneficial. What else? We have a mixture of cottages and duplexes. In this case, we're showing 44 units. 30 of those are cottages and 14 of those are duplexes, but again, those numbers aren't set in stone, just meant to be illustrative. And the extension of Chestnut Hill Road does ultimately lead you to the top of that sled hill, and we were thinking that could be a nice place to have a little, public moment, maybe a little gazebo or something where you could look out over the sledding hill. And we're also showing the potential of there potentially being a trail, a pedestrian connection that would take you down that hill all the way through along the edge of that field and over to the parking area. So again, folks could basically walk from the broader community through to get over to the park, or vice versa. When there is some snow on that hill, folks can come and park in that big publicly accessible parking lot and walk over and use the sledding hill. So we think that connection, that sequence is a lot clearer and a lot nicer in this version. And then the last thing I'll point out is on the southern edge, where the homes are sort of radiating along. About midway through, we picked a spot where we basically kind of took one house lot out, thinking it would be nice if there was a little common green space that maybe has a little pergola or something where folks could go. And again, similar to sitting at the top of the sled hill looking out, that's a place where we think you could sit and look sort of through the tree canopy down at the pond beyond, and would provide a point of access to the disc golf course that runs back through there as well. So again, thinking a little bit about communal moments, public access, ways through, just making those things intuitive and reasonable. And then lastly, for each of these, we've drawn up a sort of rendering of what that might look like. And so in this case, this is the South Road School site, showing the idea of that linear green out along South Road, the first row of homes, 150 or so feet back from the road, a mixture of cottages and duplexes. On the left, you can see the extension of Chestnut Hill Road. You can see how that road sort of continues all the way through and back to the park in the back corner. And otherwise, it really, the intention here is that it just feels like a neighborhood like any other neighborhood. It's a little series of streets and sidewalks and homes with front porches, all connected together and creating a nice little communal space. So that's what we have for South Road. I'm happy to keep going through all three of these. I can pause if you guys have questions. Obviously, we're going to talk about each of these sites in more detail with Eric as well, so I'm happy to take that however you guys would like to take that.
Just a quick question. The way you've got it set up, I think right now, the southern entrance is one way going in and the northern entrance is one way going out. Is that what you're contemplating here?
Not necessarily. I think that the roads are wide enough that could facilitate both of them being both ways in and out. It made more sense from a traffic calming perspective or traffic engineering perspective. It certainly is set up for that potential as well.
Thanks.
And just to be clear, so on the right side we have the pedestrian connection to the town park, right? And that's kind of a sidewalk-esque type of trail. And that leads in a sort of boulevard style on the north side all the way to Chestnut Hill Road, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, sidewalks throughout.
I just want to say kudos to you for taking the feedback that we got from the public and from us and making a pretty reasonable plan here. So thank you.
Just a question about the green space in the front. About how much of the usable space is there? I think it's great. It's not a leading question to like it's too much. I'm just curious. The parcel was like 7 acres that we're using.
I think that's right. It's been a while since I remember what those are. I think that was said like 7 to 8 acres. That's probably an acre in and of itself right there. And if I tab back, I'll go back to the existing aerial. It's probably not that different from the green space that's out there currently, if that gives you a sense of scale. We've kind of regularized it a bit. Here's where you can see where that northern access doesn't quite align with Chestnut Hill Road.
Right.
So that's that little bit of a bump.
And then my other question, I drive that road a lot, but I feel like that's a hill.
Mm-hmm.
So how it appears flat in the renderings. How do you address that?
Yeah, so there would be a hill. So I do think when you come in, like that green would also be a hill, sort of sloping down a little bit. So those homes would be down a little bit. It can be hard to kind of represent the specifics of that in a rendering. So, I think that would kind of drop down a little bit as you get into the site.
Yeah. Okay. I like the design and the ideas. I think it makes more sense. It's a little less dense than I think initially presented, and I think that's a recognition to the neighbors who wanted to sort of match sort of the Tuft Hill neighborhood. Mm-hmm. It's great.
Go ahead. Keep going.
All right, so let's move on to the next. The next site that we wanted to talk through was the Oliver Watson House parcel. Again, here's the Moonscape GIS version of the image. Here's a little bit nicer, a little bit more greenery. In this case, there were 4 different schemes that we had presented to you guys. The top left was really just subdividing the lot so that instead of the 1 home on a really big lot, you could potentially have 5 homes, the existing home plus 4 new ones, on roughly 20,000 square foot lots, which is what a lot of the adjacent homes have. All the other schemes looked at trying to do a little bit more, adding some cottage courts in varying sort of configurations. The upper right-hand one, the existing home was sort of incorporated as part of the cottage court. In the lower left, I showed the idea of still having the Oliver Watson House sort of peeled off on its own 20,000 square foot lot, with then the cottages sort of wrapping behind there. And then the bottom right, we introduced this idea of maybe there were some cottages and some smaller, apartment units in small 4 to 6 unit buildings. So a range of options here. And the feedback we heard from you all was to try to consider an option that was a hybrid of options C and D. Liked the idea of the Oliver Watson House being on its own 20,000 square foot lot. Again, if nothing else, you could carve that off and just sell that to someone else who's willing to put in the sweat equity to fix it up. To really think about a buffer to the neighbors, I think it was the thing that people liked about option D was that the new homes weren't kind of right up against the backs of the homes that are out there today. A preference for the cottages over the stacked flats, in part because there was a bit of a conversation about whether or not, does this want to be 55 plus? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but thinking about maybe an older demographic potentially being here, avoiding, 3-story buildings where someone has to go up the steps might be a thought. And again, a preference for homeownership on this site as well. So with that feedback in mind, this is the revised scheme that we've come up with. So again, Oliver Watson House carved off on its own 20,000 square foot lot. In this case, the cottage is arranged around a court, but having that court consolidated to sort of that half of the site, so that back right corner, which is adjacent to a number of neighbors, really could just be set aside for a common lawn that's really the septic treatment area, as well as a bunch of trees that are out there today being preserved. So really thinking carefully about that buffer down along that edge. We show 13 units in addition to the existing home in this little cottage cluster. I've got a couple of them in a duplex. Wouldn't necessarily need to be the case, but again, just trying to get a little bit of variety and interest. And those, again, are arranged around a little courtyard space that would be a common court with the parking for those homes consolidated, sort of tucked off in the back where it wouldn't really be particularly visible. And at the moment, I've got a drive that sort of comes all the way through and back out again. There's a good chance we could do that where you only really need the one drive back to the parking and back out again. It's a nuance having to do with fire access and things that we could certainly try to solve for. So for the time being, I was being a little conservative, just showing a fire lane going all the way around. But that's really not neither here nor there. And this is a rendering of then what that cottage court could look like. We actually have a very similar project to this in East Greenwich called Cottages on Green. And one of the things that this does as well is when you're actually out on the road, you see the existing Oliver Watson house here on the left, the existing neighborhood there on the right, and really it just looks like two more single-family homes get inserted into the streetscape as you would probably expect as you continue down the street. And it's really not till you tuck between those two homes that you discover there's actually this internal courtyard and the series of additional homes that extend beyond. So, questions, thoughts?
The layout on page 8, at least what I've got is this, page 8, that's the lot lines. Do you know what is behind the Oliver Watson property? It just seems like a big chunk, and on this particular page, it looks like it goes out to the other road, like the beginning of the lot goes out to the other road.
You're asking about the adjacent larger parcel that's just behind. I don't know the nature of what that is or who owns that.
Jamie, any chance you know?
It has frontage both on Fairgrounds and on the Northern Road ownership. I would be able to get that, but it's on my laptop.
I'd be curious, but it doesn't matter for tonight.
Yeah, we can get that information for you.
Excellent.
And the size of that parcel. It is, I believe, constrained by some wetlands, but we can get that information for you. Thank you.
I just wanted to make a note that one of our constituents did email me. She can't make it tonight, but she did want to say that she wanted to keep the area looking rural and to keep the nature of the neighborhood, and she can't make it tonight, so I just wanted to express that on her behalf. But this looks good to me, and yeah, thank you.
All right, we can keep going.
Okay. Last but not least, the Wakefield Elementary School site. So again, shown here in GIS, shown here as an aerial. When we were here last time, there were basically, two different options that we were presenting two different ways. And so on the top, there was the idea of there being a multifamily building. On the left, we were trying to talk about it as if it had potentially some commercial uses on the ground floor, so a mixed-use building, where in the upper right, it was the same footprint, the same scale of building, but we were just showing the numbers differently if it were all residential, what the potential might be. And then on the bottom two, we showed two variations on something more akin to what we were doing on the other sites. So in this case, doing, maybe duplexes, triplexes, maybe a couple of those little 4-plex units, 6-plex units, arranged around a green space with an access road running along the park's edge to make sure it still felt like it was publicly accessible. And there was a lot of conversation here. We've heard a lot of different thoughts on this site. But I think what came out of our conversation last time was the idea of mixed use sounded really intriguing, like option A, but nobody really cared for that L-shaped building or that configuration. It just felt sort of foreign, even though we were kind of riffing on the existing school, even though we had moved it. But I totally agree with all the commentary about that. we were introduced to the historic grammar school that used to be out here as something we could look at as a precedent. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. That was a great tip and suggestion for us to follow up on. There was a suggestion that we make sure we include some dedicated parking for Saugatucket Park because it really doesn't have any currently, and certainly people park in the existing parking lot for that purpose, so we wanted to make sure we had some clearly designated parking for the park. The idea of extending the park along the river's edge and connecting out to the bike path was something everybody was really excited about. I think we tried to look at it slightly differently. You'll see in the version we have where we wanted to make that connection even clearer, including proposing a new playground. There's a couple of existing playgrounds out there currently that are in tough shape, and one of them is right behind the two homes that are right next door, so we proposed a new spot for a new playground. And in conversations with you guys last time, we talked about how the other two sites were really ripe for maybe 2- and 3-bedroom units that might be more family sort of units. This would be the place if you were going to do some 1-bedroom apartments, studios, rentals, maybe this would be the place for that. So thinking in those terms. So the grammar school, I lost one of my images there, it's okay. This was the historic grammar school that was on the site prior to the Wakefield Elementary School that's there now. I know the aerial image is a little bit fuzzy, but we were trying to put it at a similar scale to give you a sense of it. So the building's obviously the dark rectangle there in the middle. You can see it's roughly at where the current gap is between the homes and the access drive coming in off of High Street. And then it's also basically right at the end of the pedestrian bridge that goes across in the lower right. You can get a sense of that. How it's on alignment with that. And the top right image that we lost was an image of what that school looked like from Saugatucket Park. So you were looking up the hill at the building up on the top of the hill. And we thought that was a nice precedent of what we might want to think about here. And so just to sort of superimpose, the existing school building is the red footprint shown here. And we think that based on that aerial image, the blue square is approximately where the historic grammar school would have been located. And so when we came up with our scheme, which I'll tab in a minute to get all the colored boxes off there, but just wanted to show it in relation. The idea was that we might do 2 smaller footprints out here. One could very much be in the manner of where the grammar school would have originally been in that scale, and then maybe we also include a second building further into the site that's sort of at the tail end of where the existing school is. But certainly both of those buildings would be much further from the neighbors than the existing building is currently. So this is what that could look like. So the building that's sort of facing the park, we're suggesting could be a mixed-use building with commercial uses on the ground floor and then 2 floors of residential above. And then we show a second building, which is the yellow footprint that we're showing as 2 stories also with residential units. If you took this approach, we could have around 8,000 square feet of commercial space, which is it's like twice as much as we were showing previously. But it's a nice location for it. Would really activate that park. You'd see that coming across the pedestrian bridge. You'd even see it from High Street, so we think that's a reasonable spot to consider some commercial. So all in, we're showing 8,000 square feet of commercial with 44 residential units, 22 being in each of the 2 buildings total. For the parking, when you first come in off of High Street, we have roughly 16 spaces shown right on the access drive. That's what we thought would be the right location to say here's parking dedicated to the park, because from there you could park and easily access the park. And then we have an additional 99 spaces shown in the rest of the lot, which works out to be roughly 1.5 spaces per residential unit, which is about right for these being smaller 1-bedroom type units. And enough parking to be at about 4 spaces per 1,000 for the commercial, which is a pretty good sort of average for a typical commercial use. If Muse Tavern moved here, they might need all that parking, not some of that parking, but certainly is a reasonable starting point for thinking about how this might work itself out. The other thing I did want to point out was just playing with the numbers, the commercial parking is essentially double what the residential parking requirement is. So for instance, if you were to take the commercial that we're showing out of here, that same 1 level of commercial use could become 2 floors of residential use. So if you went to a scheme that was all residential, you could do both buildings at 3 stories and have more like 66 units if you wanted. Or conversely, if you wanted to have commercial in both of these buildings, you could basically do it such that the ground floor of both buildings was commercial with 1 level of residential above each of those. So in that case, you'd have more like 16,000 square feet of commercial, but only 22 units. So again, we just wanted to say, again, there's still opportunity here to find what the right mix is, to find what the right balance of program is. Again, it's ultimately tied to parking. You could say, go to 6 stories and do all resident, but we got to find the right balance for all those things. But we still wanted to show that there is the opportunity of thinking about that a couple of different ways, depending on what the long-term interest is. Lastly, I'll point out here that you can see the path around Saugatucket Park. Again, that takes you to the pedestrian bridge. And what we wanted to show is that really clearly connecting all the way through the riverside of the site, out to the bike path beyond. And they're showing the idea of a new playground, essentially where one of the existing playgrounds is currently. But right when you come across the pedestrian bridge, then we think that's a great spot because people that are in town would see that across the bridge, and it would be sort of a draw to go over there and recognize that you're meant to go over there. It's meant to be a public space. And it's a nice way of connecting Saugatucket Park, passing the playground on your way out to the bike path. So really connecting that sequence of community amenities to make sure everybody's familiar with the fact that that's all meant to be utilized and walked through. So last but not least, here's a rendering then of what that could look like. So again, on the left, a building very much in keeping with, again, this is just for fun. We drew it almost as if it was the grammar school reconstructed, right? The same little moves with the hip roofs and the bump outs. It doesn't have to be that, but the idea is that could be the mixed-use building. So you could have commercial there on the ground floor looking out over the park. And then the second structure that's tucked in a little bit further, which could be maybe entirely residential, or again, maybe it also has some commercial on the ground floor. But if we were going to pick our battles, the one on the left, I think, is much more visible and publicly accessible. The one on the right feels like you're starting to be a little bit tucked further in. You can see the new playground as you just get across the bridge. The parking set behind, where again, it wouldn't be particularly visible from the park. And again, it creates actually a really nice buffer, I think, from these buildings to the existing neighbors that are just on the other side of the property edge there. So, and you can also see how the path makes its way all the way through out to the bike path on the right-hand side there. So, thoughts, questions about this one?
So it looks like the current access out of Wakefield School will remain for this one, correct?
The only thing I did was currently the drive is on the south and the parking's on the north. So I just flipped that, literally. So it's more or less in the same spot. But if the drive is maybe another 20 feet up High Street, because that way all the parking for the park was on the park side of the drive, if that makes sense.
No, I mean the one on School
Oh,
Lane.
up the School Lane. So
Sorry.
we kept that there. So there's still a connection to School Lane.
Okay, and people would be able to use, it's currently, was currently used.
I think you could take either approach there. So we're showing as a connection. I think if it was important to allow folks to be able to still drive through there, that could happen. I personally think it would probably make more sense to put up some bollards there that make it only emergency access, because realistically, you only really need, I think, the one-way in and out for the majority of the uses here. Mm-hmm. So again, I think that could be, again, a conversation with the fire marshal. Do they feel like they need that second point of access? If they do, maybe it's emergency only. I think pedestrians should still be able to walk right through there the way they do currently, but.
And then I think I misheard you, but the commercial space is only in the orange building, only in the one that's looks more like the old Wakefield School.
Yes.
But it could be, we have the ability to be flexible and we could creep over into the other building if we wanted to.
That's correct. So what I tried to do in the tabulations in the bottom right, I have all the numbers as it's drawn, but then on the bottom right I had alternate A, alternate B, just so you could see the math of how those would work out if you wanted to switch it up. But yes, the way we've shown it currently, especially in the rendering, we showed the orange one as 3 stories as mixed use, the yellow one as residential at 2 stories, but you could play with that.
Okay, and just curious how you decided two stories for the residential and not 3?
It had to do with the amount of parking that was available. So we were trying to figure out how you can go to the rendering. I mean, if you felt it made some sense to do the left one as 2 stories and the right one as 3 stories, you could do that. And I will also say it's all predicated too on these being largely small units. So if you sort of do slightly bigger units, it would change the equation a little bit. But this felt like a reasonable mix for thinking of this primarily as 1-bedroom units.
Okay. And the more commercial, the more parking we would need to allocate, correct? Yes.
Right. So that's why I was saying there could be a bit of a trade-off, because if you wanted more commercial, you could do it, but you have to take away sort of twice as much residential footprint for every bit of commercial you put in, because commercial has twice as much demand on the parking.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll just say, Jeremy, I like what you've done here. I think you've really taken what we've discussed and sort of decided collaboratively at our last meeting and put it into these schematics here that we're looking at. I think it really gets at specific areas in which, like, home ownership on certain sites versus rentals at others, more larger spaces for potential, like, families in certain spaces, whereas maybe younger adults fresh out of college and others. I like that aspect. I think that's something we all agreed on in previous meetings. What I'm really curious, it looks great, it looks good. I'd love that we could do this overnight, but I really want to know, how do we get there? And I'm hoping that Paragon Group can help us walk through what goes into that and how we can actually get to a point of development, working with developers, potential incentives to give them, or things of that nature. So, can we have you come up?
Who gets to use pretty pictures and draw the pictures, and then the numbers guy comes up and really takes the fun out of the room. So my apologies for that in advance. Good evening, everyone, and thank you. I didn't have a chance to join in the last working session because I had the flu, but I was watching at home and very happy to be here. So, building on what Jeremy has laid out, and this whole process has really brought forth from a concept and a planning perspective. My role, as you described, Councilman, is really to start to look at, from a development perspective, from a financial perspective, to really start to round out the picture and say, if this is the vision that the community is looking for, that leadership is looking for, one, where do you stand as kind of a snapshot of the financial feasibility of such a plan, and then two, starting to think through sort of the implementation steps. And just for context, yes, I'm a managing partner of the Paragon Group, we're a real estate advisory firm, very often work with Union Studios, not only in exercises like this, but also in delivering buildings. We're just wrapping up some duplex units on another part of the state. We've done mixed-use housing together. So, thinking about it from the sort of the back end of getting shovels in the ground is my job, which often is not as fun. So just to build on that, want to walk through a couple things. One is to kind of give an overview of the thinking and process steps that we took very quickly, to revisit some of the affordability, because that starts to play a key role in looking at how the financial feasibility comes together, and then being able to walk through each site with some recommendations and some early feedback on the numbers side. So what we've done is again, intended to be very reflective. If it were up to the pro forma maker and the financial person, each site would be a single building with as many units as possible from a density perspective to make it work. And our goal here is really to say, okay, there's been this process to shape and move the plans that were just laid out in a very conceptual way. We want a set of numbers that reflect that. So what I'm showing is not the optimal for the numbers, but it's more of a snapshot reflective of the plan that's on paper. So to do that, basically built a financial model. Costs to the best that we can, given the level of the design and the engineering. Looking at rents, for sale prices, et cetera, operating expenses, all those things that would go into the financial side. And then as part of that, really looking at some of those elements that may be considered as public or infrastructure. I'll probably overuse the term infrastructure while we stand here, but meaning demolition of the existing schools, sewer connections, some of the roadways, grading, things like that, and the utility work that needs to happen to kind of enable these developments. And then where we're headed with this is to say, if this is our best reflective costs that we see from these plans, where is that funding gap, or is there a funding gap between where we see things if someone were to pick this up and say go? So with that, real quick, if I could go back on, because I'm going to use the term affordability or AMI, I'll spend 10 seconds to move on because I know everybody has seen this ad nauseum through this process. But basically, when we're talking about affordability, and this is a bit dated because it was what we were using at the start of this process, so the numbers have gotten a little bit updated from the federal government. But essentially, what we've heard through this process is, one, a lot of varying opinions on affordability, but as we've trying to reflect what we've heard from you all and from the community, it seems to be that we're really targeting as many workforce units as possible. And when I say workforce, I'm talking about households that are making somewhere between 80% of the median income and 120. In this case, we're really trying to target 100% of the median income. So oftentimes that's kind of the hardest to get to. And I know there's folks in the room that might disagree with me on that, but on the more affordable, when you get into numbers that are 50, 60% of the area median income, there are a lot of federal programs. Not enough, but federal programs like low-income housing tax credits and things like this that can help. Once you get above that, start to really be more local, more state-level funding sources that help fill gaps. And just as a quick, and I said 30 seconds, I'm probably pushing up against it, as a benchmark, if we look at, say, 100% of the median income as a for-sale price for a 3-person household, it's just under $300,000. For a 2-person household, it's about $260,000. So you see that versus the average price as of last year was about $570,000 in town. So that's the disconnect that I think we'll see as we go into the numbers around the plans that we talked about. And please stop me if there are any questions. I'm trying to run through this quickly. So in terms of context, I wanted to also kind of do, from a financial feasibility standpoint, if you'll bear with me, we're all seeing it, and I think everybody understands that we're seeing housing prices to develop a unit of housing continues to push, continues to get higher and higher. And so just as benchmarks as we go through, we thought it might be helpful to say, if it takes $400,000 to deliver a household or deliver a house or an apartment, that unit of housing by math, is somewhere between $2,500 and $3,000 in rent per month, and somewhere in the neighborhood of $450,000 to $500,000, to make, once you pay sales commissions and profit margins, all that stuff. So from a feasibility perspective, it's really hard to deliver housing units that may be $4,000 or $5,000 or even $600,000 per unit without starting to push those price points up to these type of numbers where you're starting to push $600,000, $700,000 per unit. So now getting into the heart of the matter. So for South Road School, part of the plan that you looked at, 44 residential units, baseline, thinking that these are for sale units, the mix of some duplex units and townhouses that Jeremy described, and we can certainly kind of revisit and have plans looking at it again. But when we put some numbers to it, we're at a scale of a project of just under $30 million. And we could spend the next day or two arguing about each cost and line item. This is best guess based on comparable projects, based on a lot of numbers from the town, from gathering information about some of the infrastructure work. But order of magnitude, that's about where we are, is at $29+ million in scale. As a starting place, again, reflective of feedback that we've heard in this target of workforce housing, we started this sort of financial feasibility look, and we could certainly run it in a lot of different ways, but we started by saying, let's try and make half of those units, half of those 44 units, income restricted. So between 80 and 100% AMI, make those units, that level of 22 units in this case, income restricted or affordable to 80 or 100%, and then the remainder at market rate. And just as we're talking concept design, this is a concept for the affordability in the range. Certainly, plus minus, we can tweak and move things. But if we do that as a baseline, we start to be able to say, here's the cost to deliver, here's the cost of the value at the end of the day. And what we found with South Road, and I don't think surprising to folks, is that in order for a project to be probably most viable or most probable, high likelihood of success, there would probably need to be some infrastructure investment in advance of saying, developer, go build. So when we put that together and happy to get into the weeds or dive down into the budget for it, but we think that order of magnitude is about $5 million in infrastructure. And those components, again, very conceptual in nature and mostly based on either feedback from some numbers that the town has gotten kind of high-level estimates on, things like bringing sewer to the site, things like the demolition of the building. Some of the environmental, there's some underground storage tanks related to the school that would want to be removed to be able to set up a stage for the development to happen. If we start to look at that order of magnitude with contingencies and et cetera, about $5 million. And also want to point out, it's not just a give of $5 million. We did count that there's some acquisition price coming back into the town when a developer would buy it and kind of pick it up. And also we see it going from sort of a negative of tens of thousands of dollars a year on operations and paying for insurance and issues that happen at the school proper to kind of flipping the switch and earning real estate taxes. So we know that there's offsets from a fiscal perspective that start to pay annually once this development is in place. But what we see, and this is kind of the bottom line of the initial cut, is that if we consider that there's $5 million invested in infrastructure, the plan as drawn with 50% affordability is the case, we think that there's a remaining funding gap of about 10%. Again, very round numbers, but 10%, meaning when we do our math, we think it's about $540,000 to deliver one of the units as sort of drawn, again, with lots of caveats, hundreds of variables involved. We think that that market value, given those AMI tables and given the market units being at a higher price point, average out to be about half a million dollars in value. So there's a disconnect there of, as you can see, $540,000 to deliver, about $500 in value back to any developer. So to test that a little bit, if we start to, and I won't read this off exactly word for word, but if we start to push and say, okay, what if costs are a little higher, costs are a little bit lower, what if it were all market rate? You can see here that you can see it sort of move. Maybe it's 10% short at the outset on the baseline plan, but if we were dialing up the number of market rate units, it would be most likely profitable to a developer. If the costs were overstating or a little bit less, then it would be 5% above. So one thing to note, if we start to turn that dial the other way and make all of the units income restricted, I'd say 80% or 100%, you see we start to be sort of 60% funding gap, 50% funding gap, and I think at that point, we really rely on outside sources to help figure out and make this a financially feasible project for someone to step into through an RFP process. Please stop, man. I got one more slide on South Road if they want to let me run through it. Might help before stop pausing for some questions. So in terms of just recommended next steps, and certainly there's a lot more to it than this, but just at a high level, I think if we were sitting in that seat of owning this property and wanting to deliver the vision as drawn, I think step one would be to really dig into the infrastructure and understand that number better. We're using very round numbers based on very round estimates or per square foot or things that have happened other places, but to understand exactly what needs to happen or more closely refine what needs to happen. Potentially move on the demolition and addressing the environmental and seeking some of the dollars that may be available through DEM or other programs to help with that. And I know none of these are easy steps, but trying to lay out a framework for discussion. Rezoning, and I think this speaks to, we've seen in a lot of other communities, if there's a vision, here's what we really want to deliver. Starting to move forward on the sort of entitlements piece, in the zoning and the planning effort to say, we can define the density, we can define the scale, we can define the setbacks, we can divide the road network. We can kind of lay out all of that. It makes that RFP process or that move to have a private developer step in much more prescriptive. It's not as wide open. It helps you control and understand the variability, the time frame, as well as the predictability of what that end result will look like because you've got that defined criteria set. And that speaks to, the potential most likely to go out to.
We got a quick question here.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the graphic that you had up, and this is the one prior, with the potential sensitivities. In the middle of the page, you're talking about the baseline funding gap of 10%. And if the, down below, if the costs go up 15% more, the funding gap goes to 21%. Am I reading that right?
That's correct.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And 15% less cost, it's a 5% gap instead of the 10. What I don't understand is when you get to the bottom, at using a figure of 80% AMI for all the units, you're underwater 59%. But if you go to all units, 100% AMI, it actually drops back down. Why is that?
The for sale prices at 100% AMI are higher. So you're that much closer to the feasibility.
Okay. All right, so it's the difference between the 80 and the 100.
It is, yeah. And again, all should be taken with a grain of salt, if not a bucket of salt, given where we are. I know there's a tendency, and we see it often. It's easy to look at a concept and say it's very flexible, and once a number is on paper, people assume that there's a lot behind it. This is our best guess. So these numbers are all very round and intended to help inform thinking, inform next steps, inform how viable and what that approach might look like.
So you have said that you work on similar projects or projects for other towns in Rhode Island. You mentioned that some of these costs are able to be getting from the state or the federal government. What have similar towns and cities done to get this? Have they gone to Rhode Island Housing? Have they gone to work with companies like neighborhood builders that could pick up those costs? Are there anything that, and if this question is better answered at the end of this presentation, please answer it then. But that's kind of my question. Where should we start looking? Where have other towns and cities looked to obtain those funds? Private funds? I'm not sure.
Yeah, the answer is all of the above, which I know isn't a very fulfilling answer. But yeah, I think as you look to the different categories, for some of the infrastructure costs, DEM has grant program, EPA has grant programs, all this, looking backwards, looking forward, it's hard to tell what's going to be available, but there are programs to help with, say, the underground storage tanks. There's potential programs to help with hazardous materials, but you start to be kind of looking for specific things for specific uses. On the development side, there are programs for workforce housing. In the governor's effort right now and in the budget, I spoke with Rhode Island Housing folks this morning actually on workforce housing programs, and there are a number of programs out there. As most programs, we wish they were funded more and more usable, but some cities and towns have been able to tap into, or developers I should say, have been able to tap into some of the there's either a loan program or there's a couple of programs that are housing investment fund that help. If you're at 80% or 100%, help to start to bridge the gap with a per unit amount of money. So through Rhode Island Housing is a good source for that. Other municipalities also use, sometimes in workforce housing in particular, because it's so challenging, because you don't have that ability to use low-income housing tax credits from the federal government or some of the other funds, home funds, et cetera, or some versions of home funds. Oftentimes they're municipal level, so if there are some grant dollars or property tax incentives, low tax for a period of time, tax increment financing. I know I could jump into a whole bunch of rabbit holes and a whole bunch of things we probably don't want to discuss on this high level, but some of these programs that if you have and you know there's a tax increment to be built here, could you tap into that with some sort of bond? Could you tap into that to pay for some of the costs that help bridge that gap? Given the market, and this is me opining more than being objective, but I think I don't brush away $5 million in infrastructure investment, but I think with that out of the way, a baseline funding gap of 10%, does not scare me as someone who runs pro formas and looks at projects all day long. We're very often in the 25-30, and you start trying to figure out how to get there. So it doesn't, on its face, say go, go, go. It certainly needs some thought, but it doesn't seem, from a development perspective, an insurmountable task to be able to get there through a whole bunch of different tools and mechanisms.
Well, thank you for walking us through that. And as long as you keep collaborating with our planning department, I think we'll be in good shape. Thank you.
So, any questions? I know I sort of jumped to the RFP procurement side, and I know that's a whole discussion in of itself. So that, as Jeremy mentioned, has been kind of an assumption that there'd be a process to kind of get to a point of going out, and whether it's a super competitive or it's a developer that these are procurement approaches. But one thing I wanted to touch on when we talk about next steps, and the next steps will be hauntingly familiar, I think, from the other two sites as well. What we've seen, and it might be worth talking about a little bit, is we've seen a lot of different approaches to procurement, or going out for RFP for development like this. And some say, and there's certainly benefits to it, and pros and cons, but say, hey, let's go out right now. Let's go out right now for an RFP and have a developer come in. We're not saying that's a terrible idea. I think what we see from a objective perspective is oftentimes there's a sequence of steps that need to take place. Demolition of the building, bringing sewer to the site, understanding the entitlements and getting an approved site plan, changing the zoning. So if a developer came in now, you might be asking them to take on risk for 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, a long period of time, where often we see if a municipality has the ability to kind of walk through those sequential steps first and then go out to the procurement side, it's a somewhat more controlled, and certainly the result, you can be very, I keep using the word prescriptive, but there's certainly RFPs out there, and I know we worked on one in Barrington 2 years or so ago that was so prescriptive it was down to detailed design, and the RFP was essentially, tell us what you will do that will differ from what we have on our plan, because the neighborhood had weighed in, community had weighed in on a plan, and it was how do you stick to that plan, and if you differ, you have to explain why. So, there's kind of a spectrum of open RFPs, which are great, and then there's, on the other side, a very prescriptive that says this is exactly what we're looking for, and even time frame to do it. So, just food for thought as we walk through this.
So, based on your professional experience, I'm hearing, and make sure that you would recommend that we be more prescriptive, because it is more likely that we're going to get the result that we envision at this stage, the more prescriptive work we do, infrastructure, planning, roads, all that, right? Because
yes.
Sometimes what you envision never looks like the finished product, doesn't really look like that. It gets tweaked along the way, right? That's what you're telling me?
Yes.
Okay. And just maybe this isn't the right time to ask this question, but I'll just ask it and then you can tell me. So, for South Road School, if, say, an entity like Habitat built the homes and we had decided that some of those cottages would be rentals and not home ownership, and they passed it off to some other entity, is that all possible? I mean, if we didn't want to have all of it be home ownership, and I'm not saying I do, but
yeah, from where we sit, it's all possible.
Everything is still possible.
Yeah, this is trying to reflect this process to say, here's a plan. Certainly, it's entirely up to you on how to go from here. If a portion of that becomes rental or becomes, for Habitat, or you break it into 2 RFPs, I think.
I just was trying to think of like how feasible. It just feels like a very. I always think, when would we see this? And I'm thinking maybe in 5 years. Like it doesn't feel like we're going to have shovels in the ground in 18 months. But that's just because I think, and then for completion, it would be years, because just the sheer number of units. Am I mistaken?
I don't think so. I think you're talking, it's tough to predict, but if this were the plan, as Jeremy designed that, the plan, if everyone said, we absolutely love that, let's move forward, rezone, create it, start to move down that path and control that front end and really get to a point where school is demolished, sewerage is starting to be brought in, you can really compress that timeline. I hate to be always the person who's bringing bad news to it, but we often say when someone walks in the door with a development project, everything takes 3 years, but certainly 2 to 3 years is probably a realistic timeframe.
And just the 2 or 3 years of construction.
It's something like this, very often you could move through, you wouldn't probably build them all at once, so you'd be moving through, but you'd probably have the infrastructure in place, the roadways, maybe not completely finished, but you'd be building as you would, a subdivision or something like that, where it'd be kind of moving along. So.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
So, one thing, when we first started discussing this, it made a lot of sense to me, starting with South Road School, because I envisioned that we would be able to access a lot of federal money to take care of our infrastructure needs, which are at least $5 million, which I know that that's just an estimation, but it's probably more than that. And so when I think about the current reality and everything that we would need to do to be able to hand the project over to a developer like Habitat, and then I look at the Wakefield Elementary School project, which has a little bit more meat on the bones for a developer in terms of getting some resident or some commercial units in. That might make it more appealing to like a private enterprise to maybe focus on that site first. I don't know. It's just a thought. I'm just wondering if we could get some money in that way, that could possibly offset the $5 million cost on the other hand, or if anybody has any thoughts on that, I just, and also keeping in mind that our overall housing goal is 472, and think about some of the other large projects that we have going on. So that's just what I'm wrestling with in my head.
So are you saying potentially if Wakefield was sold to a private developer, use that money to seed the other project at South Road?
Right, and still have, AMI units in Wakefield School pursuant to whatever, requirements, or obviously that's our top priority, but if we got a little money in, that would help us in a time where we're going to have to really, I think, rely on our own resources to make that happen.
I think we should probably wait till the end of the presentation to discuss that a little more. I got a few questions on, I think it's the previous 2 slides. We talk about a scale of approximately $29 million. I just want to clarify, is that the cost of developer of acquiring the land and developing it to the point where they can sell it? Can you just kind of clarify what that means there?
Sure. It's a combined effort of the $5 million in infrastructure, as well as the remainder being all of the remaining site work, building, soft costs, legal, to get to a sales point. Yes.
Okay, so that would sort of be their break even. This would be their cost to acquire, build. They'd have to sell for that just to break even. Am I correct on that?
No, so the 29 is inclusive of the 5. So we think it's about a $24 million. If you think about it,
well, assuming they spent the 5 themselves, that 29 would be the break even. If we gave them the $5 million subsidy, they'd have a profit of approximately $5 million. Is that what we see here?
If you gave them the $5 million in subsidy, they'd be spending $24 million and basically be getting back that gap.
Okay, we don't know what their profit would be, because that would be a function of how many are, how many AMI units, how many market units, what the amount of the market unit is.
That's right. So if just as a general statement, you know, if the market value, which is the math we did, again, we can pull up a table to, you know, make your eyes spin here, but with the AMI, as we've set it as the baseline, we think that market value is essentially $500,000 a unit. So they'd be selling, you know, on average, after they've sold all those units off, they've got $500,000 per unit for 44 units. Some are more, some are less, but it's that average. So. It's you threw me off.
Well, let me ask it in a different way here.
Yes.
So, based on how it's presented here, you know, 11 units at 8% AMI, 11 units at 100% AMI, and 22 units at market rate. Is there a way to profitability for a developer such that they would undertake a project, or no? That's what I'm trying to understand as a baseline.
No, right now we're saying that's not quite there. So, when I say financial feasibility, meaning would a developer come in and spend that much money to receive this much money in return? And right now, we're shy of that.
And that accounts for the $5 million infrastructure investments up front that they wouldn't have to spend. So even inclusive of that, there's no path to profitability under this allocation.
Under this allocation, but again, within 10%, given where we are, I think with a combination of things, you know, are we over on some costs? Are there some ability to push pricing on the market rate units? You know, there's ways I think to get there. We try to be reflective here instead of saying, you know, kind of modeling the best scenario possible.
I guess my next question after that is, if we changed our allocation, just increase the amount of market rate units by just a little bit, would that potentially eat into our 10% differential, allowing it to potentially break even or get to profitability? Or what is that sort of profitability point there?
I don't know the exact point, but like if you just said no affordability, it's 34% to the good. So somewhere between where we are at 50% and 100%, there's a point, yes, that it would make sense. So the affordability, you could definitely take off some of the units and you'd get that much more closely aligned to being something that a developer would want to come in and do on top of that infrastructure being built.
But the developer doesn't have to do it for profit. So Habitat might not have the same, maybe doesn't have a profit margin that, say, ABC builders would want.
Absolutely. And again, for simplicity, we did a lot of kind of rounding out the edges in terms of profit margin and things. They're very generic. But yes, certainly not all parties would need some form of profit. We're looking at this more of could they break even? Could they pay for their costs as a very generic way of looking at it?
So if it was a nonprofit builder, whoever that is, there's still 10% missing?
Yes. Yes.
So even if it were, I'm just throwing out Habitat, even if Habitat did it, there would still be a gap of, what is it? Underwater, well, under.
But just to clarify, their cost structure, and I don't know enough about it to speak to tell you, but their cost structure might be very different than looking at just going out and bidding construction and building townhouses and duplexes.
And I don't think anyone from Habitat is here tonight because this is also their fundraiser tonight in town, so Colin's probably up the hill, a fundraiser that he'd be at.
Can I just get a clarification going back to the $29 million figure in your discussion with Rory? You're looking at $24 million build-out cost and $5 million in infrastructure.
Yeah, I'm happy to pull up the breakdown if it makes sense. Or after we could go through it. But yes, 29 is inclusive of a $5 million in infrastructure.
My only immediate concern was Rory mentioned acquisition cost. You're not factoring in acquisition cost at all.
We are actually. So
you are?
Yeah. So
in the 24?
We assumed that there'd be $1 million in acquisition in that number. Yeah.
Okay.
That's just not reflected on the slides.
No, we took off sort of the detailed breakdown just for simplicity because there's just a lot to it.
Yes. So we we, the town, would put $5 million in infrastructure costs into the property. We would sell it for $1 million, and they would still be short something. They still have to spend $24 million, and they're still short 10%.
Yes.
And at this point, that's just an assumption anyway.
Lots and lots of assumptions, yes.
Right.
Again,
Because
to back up,
people,
'cause I know it's
some people didn't think, I didn't think we were, there were any acquisition costs, but that was just me.
And just to be clear, so we understand here, it's reasonable to say that developer will not undertake a project that will incur a loss. Is that fair to say?
Right.
usually fair to say. Not,
Can
not
we
on
go back,
purpose.
can we just go back one slide? That allocation there, the 11, 11, and 22, to me, the easiest way to close the gap, as it seems to me, is to just kind of move that around a little bit. Is that, you know,
Absolutely. That would do it. What we didn't want to do is go through a process and then put numbers down that reflected what we thought would be the most viable. It was more, here's reflective of where we are based on comments to date, and this is our best guess at kind of gleaning where folks were coming out of the workshop, coming out of we can run scenarios on all sorts of different things now that we have kind of a cost model built, and happy to do so.
like even if we made some of the 11 and 11, if we made it 80%, 100%, and 120%, that would get us, you know, help alleviate the 10% differential a little bit, I would think. Am I right on that?
Yes.
And going back to the next slide, the one after this, you got in here offset by sales proceeds of real estate property taxes. We talk about potential abatement of real estate taxes as like an incentive.
So in this rough math, what we did is we said, okay, if you spend $5 million in infrastructure, someone bought it for $1 million, you know, after the fact. We also just did a quick analysis that said right now the town is paying something for that building every year in the budget for when things go wrong, for insurance, whatever else may need to be carried on that. So we assumed those costs would go away. In addition to that, we did a quick analysis on, at that average market value as shown, about $500,000. If all those units were paying taxes, we think it would be about $250,000 a year in taxes going forward. A lot to be worked out there. If there's a deed restriction, you may have a discount on those taxes. This would be a policy decision to be made. But we think that there's somewhere order of magnitude about $250,000 to $300,000 in annual revenue to the town if this project were complete and paying taxes. So that would offset certainly the remaining $4 million in investment.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, going in, I know it's complicated because we got a lot of numbers on a very conceptual model. So this is really, again, to pull back, trying to reflect, okay, if this is a plan that everybody's buying in on, here's kind of the difficulties. Before you get there, here's where some of the thorns might come in trying to get to something that's viable to the market. Or to a developer. Certainly they'll change based on what that developer might have as their incentives.
Before we move on to the next one, I think it touched on a little bit. Can you talk, I guess, broadly about different incentives a municipality can give to a developer to sort of help move it along, but help from, I guess, a price point, but also, I guess, other angles as well?
Well, certainly from a development perspective, taking a lot of the sort of entitlement risk out of it is a significant benefit and a cost benefit, meaning if it were zoned, if it were planned, here's a site plan that the town is ready to approve, it takes that away from their cost and their timeline, of having to come in to the public meetings, figure out this process. So you're a leg up if you wanted to really sort of build upon where you are. Two, I think real estate property taxes are certainly an incentive for more so in the rental when you get into Wakefield, but certainly on the home ownership, if you want to dial taxes, there's a little bit potentially more on the market rate side that will be paid, but I don't know if that's the right vehicle. Anything that would be a subsidy of helping to build out the roadways. In our model, although there's $5 million in infrastructure, the developer is still carrying a pretty significant amount of paving, green space, of landscaping, lighting, all that kind of stuff in their numbers. So taking that away would certainly help incentivize. The levels of affordability, changing those would certainly help financially incentivize a developer to be able to make it work. And I think that's about the extent. And then, of course, going back to some of the outside of the town, working with the state, can you start to apply some of these workforce housing programs to the site? It's that conglomeration of things that usually gets over something like a 10% funding gap. And again, 10% at a very high level.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, we can move on to the next one.
Yeah, great. So, moving on to Wakefield. So very similar framework here. When if I can pull the lens back a little bit to the top when I started talking, what we did is take these plans, do our best application of costs to reflect the plan, looking to the staff and the town to help with some of the infrastructure, looking at comparables, et cetera. And then what we did here is we looked at the program, understanding mostly studios, ones and some two-bedroom, a couple, I believe there are 4 two-bedroom units in our model, and also the commercial space, 1 floor, 8,250 square feet. We plugged that all in based on comparable rents from other developments, comparable retailer office space that's available right now and being leased. And so in the same manner, we did exactly the same exercise and come up with, in this case, 10% of units at 80% AMI, 15 at 100, with the remaining 33 being a market rate. And we kind of came to the same scenario. There's an infrastructure lift that would help with the viability. Not as steep of a lift in this case, more the demolition being a key one. And just for order of magnitude numbers, I believe there's a number that's been floated for the schools of just over $500,000 for demolition. So we used just over $500,000 for demolition. Whether or not that's 5 years old or outdated or how scientific it was, we use them as placeholders. So as an example, bringing utilities, roadway parking, we don't know quite exactly what kind of utility upgrades are needed. Again, we see that this would be offset somewhat by property taxes and an acquisition. We carried an $800,000 acquisition in this case as a starting place. And in this scenario, we saw a funding gap, a shortfall of about 15%. At this level, not too dramatically different than what we saw at South Road. But essentially, we thought the units could be delivered just because of the type of units that we're talking about, and based on comparables at a lower number, about $400,000 a unit. But that market value sat around just under $350,000. So we saw that 15-ish% gap. And again, when we changed costs, pushed them up and down, changed the market rate, we saw sort of the elasticity of that and how it moved. And I'm going to say, as it's my job to say things that are slightly unpopular, but one factor that weighs into this, there's a couple of things. One, if we go back to the beginning, I said if it costs about $400,000, the rental break-even is about $2,800 per month. Here it comes out on average from what we put in based on some comparables to about $2,400, so there's a little bit of shortfall in the market rents for viability. But the commercial space, and this is not trying to lead the witness or say the commercial space is a bad idea in any way, shape, or form, but tons of mixed use. From a financing perspective and from a pure viability standpoint, it does have a little bit of a negative pull in our analysis. And this is just math. I know this has been a topic, and I don't want to step into it again. It's not trying to lead a discussion one way or the other, but there is an impact, kind of like in the parking. If we turn the commercial off and on, you can see a little bit of a change in the way the financial feasibility works. Just because there are a couple factors that, one, when you go out to finance commercial space, unless you have a tenant, it tends to kind of have a negative in the translation of rental income. There's just some math that works behind it to pull down the value a little bit. You see that show up here, and it's probably a good half of that 15%. But again, we can quickly get into the weeds in that, and I don't intend to that, but I know the 15 might surprise people based on the kind of information we just described.
Did you have an acquisition cost for this property?
$800,000 as a plug number. So yeah, if we remove that, it certainly impacts the analysis.
So that commercial property you just mentioned, inclusive of the commercial property, that's why even if all our market rate, we're still seeing a differential of about 11% here.
It's one factor, yes.
So if it were all residential, maybe that would be a positive percentage number?
I don't know off the top of my head. I think it'd be closer to positive, but I don't know if it would push it all the way over.
So assuming the costs stay the same, there's no change to those that you've estimated here, all market rate would make this sort of a losing project for a developer in the sense that they would incur a loss if they were to undertake it?
Given the fact that we assume that there's a fairly heavy infrastructure cost still on the developer, we assume that there's, per square foot, so it's not the cheapest building to build. We assume that there's a fair amount of parking and roadway improvements that have to happen. But again, we need to challenge everything. This is what we tried to do, in all honesty, is to be as fair as possible and go right down the line with best information and not look at the result until we were kind of done. And then, so we weren't trying to shape it to be exactly what the result is. We tried to get as accurate as possible, again, to inform. And we expect to run 1,000 iterations of this, and we can certainly look at a table that has turn off the acquisition, turn off this, turn off that, turn on this, and see just from where we are how that impacts.
But in your experience, and you're working on a number of these projects in many communities, a gap of 10 or 15% isn't unusual. You've seen much larger gaps.
Absolutely.
And projects still go forward. Okay, so we shouldn't be intimidated or concerned that at this stage it's a 10 or 15% gap to profitability for a developer.
I mean, we think it's real. We think that there is a disconnect, and part of it's just costs are very high right now. So it's a problem to solve, but it does not seem like an unsolvable problem.
Okay. That's what I heard. That's what I want to make sure that you answered it again. Thank you.
Yeah, I know I'm trying to be objective to a little bit of subjective opinion, but based on my experience, yes.
All right, we can keep going.
All right. So on Wakefield, very similar recommended next steps. In fact, we think pretty much the same. Starting with understanding what that infrastructure need is, the demolition, if there's been any environmental work done, if there's any utility implement, start to understand that we put in a $1.9 million number. Is that real? And then understanding what that, more and more refined, and you're moving down a path that someone's going to have to figure out regardless. So you're kind of moving down the sequential steps, potentially demolition of the building, rezoning, same as before, and then, to control what your outcome is, maybe moving down the ladder with those steps to get more and more prescriptive for someone to be able to come in, potentially use some of these other sources and incentives to make a project that's viable and get the end result that you want. Thoughts or questions, or should we
go ahead?
So in Oliver Watson, same process applied. Looked at comparables as best we could, looked at infrastructure as best we could, looking at, in this case, as Jeremy mentioned, for sale units, kind of agnostic on whether or not there's an age restriction for our analysis, but these are a combination of duplex and cottages that were all 3-bedroom. And then for this, based on the feedback heard to date, we put that line in the sand, stake in the ground at 50% income restricted, again, using that workforce 80 and 100%, with the remaining being at a market rate. In this case, we also were in that same range, and I didn't mean for all these to come out so similar to each other, it's just how the math shook out. But what we could foresee here is some of that upfront infrastructure as opposed to the others. I think one of the questions that's come up, and some folks in the room might know a lot more than we do about it, but I think Jeremy had mentioned septic, understanding, are there constraints on septic? There was discussion at one of the meetings about a community septic and a combined septic for the 13 units or the individual. Are there any constraints in either that or water that need to be factored in before you say it's 13 units or 14 units or 12 units? But figuring that out a little bit, and it also helps in the same way as the others move down the line, have some of those costs off of the books of potential developer to make it more viable. And then in the same way here, we thought price points were a little bit higher, a 3-bedroom new townhouse or duplex. With those constrictions, we're again about 500,000 units. We thought it cost a little bit more, about 580,000. And if you see, at all market rate, it's well above kind of that break-even point. At 15% less cost, it's kind of the gap goes away. So I think in this case, there was a little bit more elasticity or a little bit more flex to make things work with a couple of tweaks here and there. I'll wrap up quickly on the recommended next steps. I think, as I mentioned, defining the septic, going back to the earlier conversation about do you go ahead and subdivide early and put for sale the existing house and let somebody buy that at sort of a nominal value and take that on as an equity or sweat equity piece. And then as you're going through similar processes as the other. But I think it was a little bit less intensive, certainly, when we thought 5 million or 1.9, this is in the hundreds of thousands potentially to really get it ready for a development process.
What's your assumed acquisition cost for this one?
It was only $200,000.
So, 3-bedroom units sort of cancels out being agnostic on age restriction because older people don't need 3 bedrooms. So I think by planning this for all 3 bedrooms, we're essentially making a decision that it's not going to be for age restriction, which isn't really my favorite thing. Just, given the history of the house.
Jim, do you want to speak to it?
There's certainly no reason you couldn't mix 2s, 3s, do all 2s. One thing I would be curious to ask Eric is what impact that has, the value of a 2-bedroom versus the value of a 3-bedroom, trying to make these numbers work.
Or even a 1.
I believe it would help, but we could run that as a scenario, certainly. Yeah, it wasn't the intent to sort of cancel that path in any way, shape, or form. It was, I actually had the same thought in running through the numbers.
Thank you.
I'm kind of with Patty on that a variety of sizes would put a variety of family structures there, and that might be more interesting and diverse and inclusive. So I don't know if it changes the number of units. I feel like 13 was more than we talked about, but I thought we were at 10, but that's just from October, or whenever you came back. But maybe it would be, maybe a variety would be more profitable, more interesting, I don't know, more, I'm looking at the architect, not the math.
I agree, more variety is more interesting for sure. I don't know what it does with the numbers, and I will just say from experience, when we typically work on projects at the scale of like 12 units, the average developer would say, I don't want to spend, I don't want you to design 4 different houses. I want you to design one house that I'll repeat. We can be clever about certain things. Now, again, the beauty of you guys controlling an RFP process is you could say, we require 2 or 3 different options here to get the variety we're looking for, be it through bedroom counts, unit sizes, some at 1, some at 2. I think you could think about that to make sure you get the result that you're going for.
Yeah, because I think we had a spirited discussion about age restriction.
We have
The really old at the table, not to, right, we had a variety of feelings about putting it on or not. But
Right.
I like the idea of any variety. My neighbors are retired and they help my other neighbors' kids get on the bus, and it's really sweet to watch all that. So I think that's what I think about when I think of variety of people living in a small development. People would pitch in to speak.
And we can explore, different schematics that, show different varieties as he talked about.
Yeah, and again, I think what Eric's pointing out, this was just meant to be a baseline for it to have all of these conversations. And as you'd have a more in-depth conversation, what would be fun is really playing with some of those numbers and saying, what if we up this and lower this and change this? What is going to 10 units do versus 13? Okay, the gap just grew to 20%. Are we comfortable with that? Are we willing to put in another million to get that much more variety? Where's that million coming from? A lot of conversation yet to be had ahead. So again, we were trying to lead with, none of this was meant to be the final plan, but it was meant to be a plan that we can really start to dial much more closely up or down based on what you guys were thinking about considering.
Now, based on recommended next steps, seems like for all three properties, fairly consistent. Step one would be refine infrastructure, engineering, and costing. Does it make sense at this point to sort of fine-tune these figures to get to a point where we can understand what makes sense for developers and what doesn't? I think we've had some questions tonight of, what's the break even, what's the price point, if we reallocate, is there, a way where a developer can, run with this because they can, either break even or make profit on it. But you keep saying, these are good estimates, but we can always refine them. From here, can we go to that next step now, or what do you think?
I think we can. We could certainly. It's easy to run a lot of different models on paper. I think the hard part, the variability in the infrastructure is typically much broader than, say, the construction of a house. You can control factors in a house, right? Your level of finish, your level of detail, your fixtures, your appliances, all that stuff is somewhat controllable. It impacts the price point, and the market rate units and how these things move together. But usually at this stage, the biggest variables are, we have 1.5 million to bring sewer to South Road. Based on some numbers, I don't know how recent, we have 522,000 is the number for demolition based on, an estimate at a point in time. 1 million in environmental remediation, including UST removal. Those are big numbers. And I don't know, standing here, how precise they are. They might be very precise. They might be estimates from a subcontractor, et cetera. But I think if I were sitting in your shoes, I'd want to understand those probably to the next step. If the rest of this process is kind of pointing to, yes, this is kind of the vision that the community may want to see, then I think that's a recommended step would be to refine that number. It might be 3 million and not 5. It might be, unfortunately, 6 million and not 5. But getting that understanding probably helps inform how quickly and how realistic it is to kind of continue down this path.
All right. That's sort of where I'm at. I'd like to sort of move to the next step, refine some of these costs. I think we have a good sense of where we're at with at least the first two properties. I think the third property, we kind of maybe want to see some different schematics, variabilities, variety, sort of see what we like, see what can work there. And maybe at the same time, with respect to the third property, we can also define the costs in the engineering, can we? With different varieties?
We can adjust our rough assumptions. I would say to understand like the septic costs, we might need some engineering, something outside of the kind of scope and expertise that he's standing in front of you.
Go ahead.
So just following up on what Patty had started to talk about, I'm interested in what's the easiest project to get going to see progress? Would it be the smallest one? Would it be, in your opinion?
I think from a pure timing perspective, and please weigh in, I think Oliver Watson, we could probably get our hands around the infrastructure, the other components to it pretty quickly. As opposed to, it might take a while on some of the other larger, depending on where it is. And again, Jamie, I'm looking at you. I don't have a good sense of those.
Although we did some work on that.
Just a couple of things on South Road 2. We have some really good costs on demolition and potential environmental. But with regards to sewer, water, road infrastructure, we're seeing a variation in those numbers. They're moving based on oil prices, PVC piping prices, conduits going through the roof for underground utilities, 3 conduits in the road for fiber, phone, and 1 spare. So there's a lot of variables to that. We have a contract with Union Studio right now. If you want to move forward, we can talk about some potential contractual adjustments to move to another phase of this. They've done a good job tonight and in previous meetings talking about the conceptual aspects of this, and hopefully this has been extremely helpful to the town council about what you're facing. You know, you're looking at South Road School with a $5-6 million investment. You're looking at Oliver Watson at maybe we'll round it off upward to a $500,000 investment in infrastructure. And Wakefield, you're looking at, you know, $2.5 million of infrastructure investments. Jeremy and I spoke this afternoon specifically on the question both Patty had and Deb followed up on is, you know, is there any low-hanging fruit here? I think if you look at maybe tackling the smaller funding gap, maybe easier to close, and also from an engineering design standpoint, the less engineering, the less infrastructure, may be easier to get your hands around quicker, and also the permitting aspect may be less, and you can package something up in a more reasonable time frame because there are less moving parts. I think perhaps what we need to look at internally and in concert with the council is what is the next step on the financial commitment of design and you know, vetting things out. We could go to what's called a 10% conceptual design, which is a little deeper dive into engineering aspects of one or all of the sites, and you may say just move forward with one right now. Again, Jeremy and I had an interesting conversation this afternoon, and he attributed to it, the smaller the scale, the better we can learn.
Yeah.
So if you did Oliver Watson, you may be able to learn a lot. Doing a project like that, you may be asking the state for less financial assistance and perhaps have a greater stance of success. We also may find out from the state they don't want small projects, they want big projects, so we may need to pivot to a bigger project also. So I think there's a next step. I think, you know, Eric's laid that out well. You're not shovel ready yet. You're not put it out to RFP, RFQ yet. There's another step we need to take, and hopefully you have a clear grasp and understanding of that.
One other aspect, I want to hit the question, but I think I know the answer. Is there ever an advantage to packaging these multiple projects together for a developer? Would they be more interested? We're talking about 3 discrete projects, 3 discrete RFPs, and the time frame is wide open. Are there big developers out there that would say, we'll take on all 3?
I'm a little afraid to answer that there probably are. I don't know. I doubt it, but I don't know definitively. I think for a lot of developers, especially right now, right, with potentially some headwinds coming or happening, it's always about sort of risk and return. I sound like I'm from my class now because I say it all the time, but you know, if they're walking the door right now and coming in where there's a concept plan on paper, but there's a lot of these unknowns about the infrastructure, how it's going to come together, I think it might be difficult to get someone to really jump in and be willing to spend tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in that design process and get to a point where they might just be told, you know, no thank you, we don't like that design. So I'm not trying to sell moving it down the path, but I think for any big developer, they'd want to come in with some level of certainty, even more so than a local committee.
Which we don't have, and we're having trouble wrapping our heads around the individual projects. I mean, given the tenor of your answer, I guess the question becomes, would it be a bad idea to try and package all 3? And it sounds like the answer is yes.
it might be more of just, could you logistically even pull that off? In other words, any one of these is going to be a big effort. You know, we're talking about the infrastructure gaps and stuff. Like, one of the things we thought would come out of this is maybe a conversation about priorities, which we're starting to dabble into a bit. It was almost unfortunate that his models all said 10 to 15% gap.
Yeah.
We were kind of imagining one was going to be like the 50% gap, and one was going to be the like, oh, this one's the definite one that you'd want to start with. But they all ended up kind of in that range of, we may have a project here. So
I'm happy to put the concept to bed. I just didn't want to not ask the
That's
question.
a good question. So I really like what Jamie said about we can learn some good lessons if we start with a smaller project. I mean, the staff will learn, any future council member would appreciate. I feel like we learned a lot with ARPA, that we might have done it all differently, but we didn't, so I think we can do a much better job starting with something small where we can all learn and benefit from either the grant writing, the infrastructure, the RFP piece, the procurement. I kind of like although I would like to see South Road because it's sat empty for so long, but I think it makes sense to go small and do it well and learn rather than take on the biggest one, spend $30 million, and people go, what the heck were we doing? That's just me.
So, I'm thinking positively about this, in the sense that these are smaller gaps than I expected, especially with how much affordable housing we're trying to build in South Kingstown. We are picking a great time to build affordable housing. The state is aligned in that direction. And while at the moment I'm not completely in agreement with picking one project at a time, because sometimes when that happens, they'll just drop a project anyway. So that would be my hesitation in that. I think that we just have to do a great job at leaving no stone unturned on funding. Yes, there is headwinds coming, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't go as hard as possible in order to find these alternative funds, especially if everyone else is feeling that way. We should not be standing on our heels. We should be on our toes and trying to go find that funding. Rhode Island Housing has gotten millions of dollars in funds, and they haven't allocated any of it. They've had 4 housing directors at this point, and I think that there's some money there that we can use to close that gap. And I would also even encourage, looking at the nonprofits. So that's how I feel about that. So I think that right now, our challenge is to try to close those gaps as much as possible, not to just focus on one project, but to really try to holistically get this done, because our town needs affordable housing. We don't need 9 units. We need the, upwards of 70 plus affordable housing units that we're here talking about tonight.
Right, Mike. With regards to the discussion and Mr. Wedgemont's comment, I don't think Eric, Jeremy, or I are here tonight saying pick one and don't do anything about the others. I think if one of those is sticking out in your mind that may have a greater opportunity of success, and I mentioned earlier that I've been involved in projects over the 30 plus years where you're working on one and then you get a phone call from a congressman or a senator and says, do you have a $10 million shovel-ready project? And all of a sudden you dust the project off and say, yes, I do. Because they're not looking sometimes for the $500,000, $1 million. They want a big splash. So I think if you have one that maybe has a greater sense of success because the investment's smaller to start, you can learn from that project. To me, it doesn't mean you stop working on the other 2. You are moving forward on those other 2 with the understanding there's just a bigger, we talk about these 15%, but understand there's $5 million before you even talk about the 15% at South Road School. So there's 15 plus 5. So Wakefield's $2 million was still a gap. So if you packaged all 3, you're going to ask someone to go out and find $8, $9 million. So again, if there's something that has a chance of maybe getting shovel-ready quicker, asking for a lesser amount with regards to assistance, maybe you're challenged and you go after that. To Jay, Deb, and everyone's point, don't lose sight of the others. Continue to move forward on those. Don't just say, Jamie, you know, as a planning partner, just move to 10% design on one, well, let's move to 10% design on one potentially, why we're also a little slower moving on the others, but not stopping on the others. I don't think either one of the three of us here tonight is saying, pick one and don't do the others. I think we're saying there may be one that's more viable. Why you're still vetting all the other sites, the other two sites, and refining those so that you're ready to, you know, use the word pivot. You may need to pivot based on funding sources. Someone may say, we're not funding single-family houses, we're doing rental. All of a sudden, you need to pivot quickly. Will we have the ability to pivot? And I think that's something we need to be prepared for.
So, do you know?
Go ahead. I have a response to that, but go ahead.
Oh, you what?
I'd like to respond to that.
Oh, go ahead.
So, with respect to Oliver Watson, it appears we're sort of making the assumption that smaller projects are more viable, more ready to go. Now, as percentage-wise, you know, the shortfall as to feasibility is sort of on the larger side of Oliver Watson, but when you break that down to a cost, it's smaller. So from that perspective, that makes it more viable, I think is what we're getting at here. But what I also want to point out is the figures that we're looking at with respect to Oliver Watson are based on the allocation and the schematics drawn up by Union Studios, which some council members sort of has some disagreement with, which once those schematics are changed, there will certainly be a change to the figures that we're looking at here from a financial perspective, which could change the feasibility. So I hate for us to say now, oh, this is the most viable, but we don't exactly agree with the schematics, which the figures are based on.
So that's right. I do think that next step we should do with all three sites. Because again, that's going to be an iterative process. I think what will be fun is it's not just numbers or not just concepts. Those will run in concert, fine-tuning, and I do think that the discussion about priorities will be a more meaningful conversation probably after we have a next round of refinement on some of these costs, right? I think, again, the goal of tonight was to see, are any of these just outliers? Or like that one, it doesn't even make sense. And like I said earlier, it's kind of funny, they all kind of landed in a similar place where, they all do maybe still make sense. So I would advocate for taking the next step on all three and then postponing this conversation maybe until we've gotten through that round.
Okay, great. I just want to say one last thing. With respect to determining which one is most viable, I think it's like a prerequisite that we do this for finding the cost and engineering, so we have a clear picture of what makes sense. Because if it makes sense financially, then we can move it along. If it doesn't, then it's not as viable, then who knows where it's going to go. And I think at this point, we really don't know, because all of them are showing to us not feasible.
So, I hear what you're saying about the viability, but I think it's, what I heard was the infrastructure costs are so much less for the smallest property that would be easier. I didn't think of it as viability or profitability. I thought about it as like, we're not going to sink a lot into it to launch the project potentially. And I hear what you're saying. If we tweak a few things, I want to move all three along, trust me, but if we can see results right away, that would be great. My question was, and I think this is the answer, and then I'll ask you, last year we only brought on 4 or 5 affordable units all through town. So when we say only 9 or only 5 or whatever, last year if we only brought on 4 or 5, just the Watson could meet that in one project, and that's not any other build projects, any other thing that's happening. So we don't typically bring a lot of units online annually, but then my other question was, you're the planning board chair, whatever, not chair, you're the liaison, sorry, couldn't think of the word. You know what projects are coming before you, so how many units are coming in the pipeline and how many are affordable? Potentially, I know not everybody's at the planning board stage. Some people are still talking to you. There are projects that Jim has talked to us about privately. So what do you see?
I mean, currently right now, the largest project we have in the permitting queue is South County Commons. That's 104 units, 52 in 2 separate buildings. That's going through the planning board now. If that were approved, there's still, even with approvals from the planning board, there's 6 to 8 months in architectural and building design. Then they're in financing, so there's still 12 to 18 months away from construction. And again, given market conditions and the value of the dollar and the ability to borrow and interest rates, there's so many moving parts, but that's the biggest project, which would bring, 40 units or so, 30, 40 units of affordability. But again, if they started construction, we'll even round it off 18 to 2 years from now, there's still 18 months to 24 months in construction. You wouldn't see an occupied unit in 3 to 4 years. So I think Eric and or Jeremy made the point that, I think Eric said it is, he always starts with 3 years.
Right. And
Yeah.
then, any other projects? Isn't the one NORPAC?
We have NORPAC, but they came to the planning board in a preliminary manner. They're not in their permitting queue. That's 300 plus units. Again, it'd be a complement, so 25% affordable. That could bring another 75 plus units. If they had approvals today, they don't have architecturals done. There's still state permitting. There's still intersection improvements that may need to be done with RIDOT. They're still 3 to 4 years away from, having an open house and a ribbon cutting.
Right.
So it doesn't mean you shouldn't stop trying, and we shouldn't encourage some, high quality, well designed projects. It just takes time. With respect to moving forward on all three, I would appreciate that. We do have some funding available within the department. We have some capital money coming in starting July 1, so I don't think we would be short on the financing side of contract amendments with our group. It's just moving things forward and getting the right numbers. I will say, Eric has it as part of his slides. There are Excel spreadsheets and charts to go to support this. We'll end up distributing those in a refined manner to the council so you can see some of the background work. Just remember, I'm one of those, potentially being able to be not affordable, but looking at that 55 and older concept. I think most people that I've worked with in the development realm are still looking for 2 bedrooms because people age, sleep habits change, and if it's a couple, sometimes there's a 2-bedroom scenario. There is always children who may want to stay, so that's the 3rd bedroom. And just a reminder, when you go to 1 bedroom, you change the price point and you change the affordability point. So a 3-bedroom may be able to sell for $300,000, where a 1-bedroom may only be able to sell for $225,000. Still requires a bathroom and a half and a kitchen, and those infrastructure costs don't change that much. So again, for every reaction, there's another reaction to that. So as Eric pointed out, that Excel spreadsheet keeps sliding left and right of a number. So there's a process.
I got one more question on Oliver Watson. You said that you assumed $200,000 acquisition cost and $330 infrastructure. Jeremy, I think, had mentioned that we could carve off the actual house and 22,000 square feet?
20,000.
20,000 square feet.
The zoning around there is.
That wouldn't require any real infrastructure or doing anything. If somebody wants to buy that house as a separate lot, we could start with that.
I believe so. I carried a nominal number in the models that you'll see, but certainly that could be done at any point in time, I think.
The only thing I would caution you on is we're at conceptual design right now. Until we're more refined, I would not advise you to sell that.
Okay.
Because if you sell it, you may find out 6 months from now that you need a little more land.
Okay.
And you just sold it.
Okay.
Again, for septic, for a turning radius, for something.
That's fine. The 220 figure for acquisition cost didn't take into account the idea of selling that separately.
It did not.
Okay.
You'll see in the quick kind of fiscal analysis, like I mentioned before, where we would do some estimate of taxes coming in. I included $25,000 in that acquisition. That is completely pulled out and arbitrary.
That's fine. I just wanted to make sure I understood how the numbers arrived at. Thank you.
So I just want to remind everybody, and I know I've said this many times before, and just sort of my desire to see the property utilized for something along the lines of the donor's wishes. And so, to that, I keep thinking about an assisted living facility that I went to visit when a family member needed something like this. And it was a family-run organization in Warwick called Commonwealth House. And they had moved from California, where this sort of family-style idea is very popular, where, you know, they have the big house, say, and then they have little assisted living cottages where, you know, older people with varying needs could live. I know they do accept some Medicaid patients. Obviously, this is a different model where it would be more like housing, but it can be done at different points of the median income guide. There could be some focus on restorative agriculture, which is something that is in line with, you know, the current political reality. So it could be something where we're sort of pushing something that could maybe get some grants. I just want to put it out there so that we think about that again when we're deciding what to do.
All right, any other thoughts before we open it up? All right, some good discussion, great presentation. We look forward to what's next. We are at public comments section, so anyone in the audience wishes to speak, I invite you to just come on up. I'm going to ask that you introduce yourself. We're going to limit you to 5 minutes. Once you begin speaking, this clock over here is going to begin winding down, so you can use it as a sense to sort of pace yourself. So, Mike, go ahead.
Hi, Mike Agus, Cardinal Lane. So the EDC has 2 surveys that Jamie and Jim are looking at and want to get in front of you. One is a survey about using the Wakefield Elementary School as an incubator or remote office, mostly, is the proposal. And I think the home run is to get an incubator or businesses started there and so forth. And I really think we'd like to get that survey out because we think there is a lot of demand for that. And I think when we start looking at Tower Hill and other projects going on, there's going to be a need for space for businesses before the Taj Mahal is built, right? So we would like to get your input and get that survey done as quickly as possible, and I know they're working to get that in front of you. I think it's an excellent pilot opportunity because you can look at what's the viability of commercial there, and should both buildings be commercial and residential on top, et cetera. So I think it's just a really good pilot opportunity to test out a lot of different concepts like mixed use and so forth. And then we also have designed a housing survey that we would review with the employees at URI and at South County Hospital. We already have their permission. They want to review it, of course, first, to ask their employees how many of you would want to live in South Kingstown if you could afford it, and what is your family income, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't want to just do surveys to do surveys, but we're asking, is this going to be useful in this exercise? But I think you could understand the demand for the different uses if we went forward with these. So we encourage you to rule in on that. So the third item I wanted to talk about is you've got to put some bus stops in those developments, because obviously parking is a big financial driver here, and so we ought to look at as reducing the need for parking in some way, and public transportation is a good way to do that. I lived in Brookline, Mass. we had a parking space with one parking space with our place, it could be a business to separate the parking and do that as a business in and of itself. I don't know, but I'd like to make sure we contemplate public transportation when we're talking about these facilities. And towards that end, let me skip that for a second. The other thing is there is a proposal, I believe, on the fairgrounds to take that Siemens property and build workforce housing on it in addition to manufacturing. Is that correct? Yeah, so that's in the pipeline. So that kind of just begs the question that maybe there are some private funding sources that are available, maybe from URI, maybe from South County Hospital. Got to be careful here, because what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Maybe, at Google, they give their employees this was 10 years ago, $1,000 stipend to live in the town, okay? To live within 15 miles of Google headquarters. Okay? If we could find a funding source and we could do that in this town, why wouldn't we have all of our employees that work for the town live in the town? If that was feasible, if we could find a conveyance fee or something like that, and give them a stipend. If you got two people living here and they both work here, then it's $2,000. So one way to increase the affordable housing is to increase the income of the people as well. Another way to maybe head this off. That's my big bad idea for the day, I think. And finally, Oliver Watson, I love that concept, and I love the fact that it was given to the town for senior housing, but man, we had to tear the keys away from my mother before she killed herself, and my father-in-law definitely had several accidents. We don't want seniors driving, and that's not a really publicly accessible place for seniors. So the concept of having I've heard of this graduated stuff, right, where you have you move into your house, and then you start to fail, so they move you into the more intensive care facility and so forth. That kind of a concept, self-contained, I think would make sense. But having a senior housing out there with everybody having a car, I have a hard time with that. So maybe we could call the building in the Wakefield Elementary School the Watson Senior Center or something like that. But just a thought.
All right, Mike, you are past the 5. You're the first one to go. There's some others in the audience. You want to be respectful. Thank you.
Nope, you bet.
My quick question. You mentioned 2 surveys the EDC is doing. The second one's audience was URI, correct?
URI and South County Hospital.
Okay, in the first survey, who is the audience for that survey?
It is the first list is the Chamber of Commerce mailing list.
Okay.
And any other businesses that want to participate.
Gotcha.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Hello. So my name is Bethany Grace Sorrentino, and I'm here first as the chair of the Affordable Housing Collaborative Committee. We've prepared a statement, so this was written before the evening and we all agreed to it. So I'll read that, and then I also have a couple comments just from sitting here that are of my own. And so this is our prepared statement. We, the Affordable Housing Collaborative Committee of South Kingstown, want to thank the Town Council, town staff, and Union Studios for being here tonight to thoughtfully advance our public housing strategy. Our committee is here to support the council and town staff as we seek to meet our housing goals in innovative ways, through promoting year-round rentals, through helping homeowners to stay and not sell, and through the building of town-appropriate housing stock that matches and enhances our vibe as a community. The 3 town-owned, underutilized properties under consideration tonight represent a unique chance to create LMI housing. The Housing Initiative workshops hosted by Union Studio last year through a contract financed by the Affordable Housing Trust Fund initiated a town-wide dialogue that demonstrated a desire by residents to see these public lands used in whole or in part to support the creation of affordable housing options for our town. We request that the Town Council take action at tonight's meeting and provide clear guidance for the town staff around the council's housing goals for these properties. The Affordable Housing Collaborative has researched sample timelines of next steps in order to be shovel in the ground ready within 2 years. Our members have studied similar projects in comparable municipalities, such as Narragansett and Revere and Bridgewater, Massachusetts. From this research, we have a selection of sample RFPs that are created to solicit projects, providing the most amount of LMI housing at the widest range of AMIs as possible. As a cost reduction strategy, this committee could assist town staff in preparing a similar RFP that reflects our collaboration with other town committees, such as sustainability, as well as the best practices in innovative affordable housing projects in New England. The mission of the Affordable Housing Collaborative is to advise and assist the council and town staff in meeting the town's housing goals. We are ready and willing to move forward with you and the town staff to retain residents we cannot afford to lose, residents who work in local businesses and public services, residents who have kids in our school system, and residents who are retired after decades of working hard and building life in our town. So let's make timely, informed decisions tonight and help keep them here. So that was our prepared statement, and I would love to share these RFPs with you. One of them is very relevant. And then just some comments from myself. So again, my name is Bethany Sorrentino. I'm from Wakefield. There's a couple of things I just want to comment on. I know we've discussed AMI levels before, and so I want to say it again. 80 to 120, to me, is going to leave the real working class behind. My husband and I are both lifelong residents. We've worked full-time here for our whole careers. We're raising our kids here. And we have been below 80% AMI for most of our life together. We are currently below 80%. So a project that would leave behind working families is probably not, in my mind, truly an affordable housing project. So there's that. The other thing, in the profitability and feasibility things, I want to remind you of something that Colin Penny said at this very podium once. He said, "I lose money on every project I build." That's his job, right? Is to try not to, try to lose as little amount of money as possible. But the point is, nonprofits have a very different funding scheme. We don't know exactly how they do it. And so for us to try to predict what's going to make it feasible for them is probably impossible. The RFPs that I have to show you would accommodate for that. We don't have to know how they're going to fund it. That's their job to figure out. So, trying to break even with a project only makes sense if you're trying to make a profit. And since we've been pretty clear from the beginning that we are at least interested in nonprofit options for developers, the entire question of will this project break even is maybe not even relevant, since a mission-minded nonprofit would not be trying to break even. So there's that. The other thing I wanted to just mention is a couple of positive things. For instance, nonprofit developers particularly, but any developer who is doing this kind of work presently, probably knows how to leverage funding that we're not aware of. There are CDBG grants. This is money through HUD that could be used for infrastructure. One of these developers might want to take on some of those infrastructure projects themselves because they might know how to leverage funding that, I don't know, you don't know, So anyways, there are grants that could be used for infrastructure. And don't forget that last year in the 2024 election, Rhode Island approved a housing bond. That money is still going to be allocated. Excuse me, my mouth is dry. What I hear from the people of Improvidence is that it's still being sorted out who is going to allocate it and how. But we are far enough along that I think we would be very competitive. So don't forget that that money is there. That money is ours. State money, right? That cannot be taken back by the federal government. So that money is still in the pipeline.
A lot of great thoughts, Bethany.
Yes.
You are over the 5. Just want to
This is my personal
conclude.
comment time. So the beginning part of my statement for the committee, I feel like was a separate sentence. So the only other thing I want to tell you is that my committee feels, I personally feel that no further contracts are needed. We don't need to spend more of the taxpayers' money, that we have enough expertise to move the project along. I also want to tell you that our colleagues on the Narragansett Affordable Housing Collaborative, in the same amount of time that we have been doing these workshops, have begun a project and brought an RFP out, which is currently active. So we've been studying those timelines. We've been studying the action steps that towns who are building affordable housing the right way are doing it. And we have a roadmap, and we know we could provide you with some possible action steps. So I'd love to share these RFPs with you. I can email you.
Thank you. All right. Anyone else in the audience wish to speak? Anybody just come on up?
Hi. My name's Colin Murphy. I live in Teft Hill and Chestnut Hill Road, so I'm pretty much right across the street from South Road School. Emailed you guys a couple times, so just want to say appreciate your time and effort on this. Jeremy, Eric, you guys too, great work. So one, this is going to impact like the people in Teft Hill a lot, right? It's that western access to Curtis Corner Middle School, the athletic fields there. That's pretty much going to go away for a lot of people here. I know. Actually, this new design. Thank you for putting direct, robust, dedicated public access to those fields from the west side of South Road. But what I'd also like to see is public parking there as well. A lot of people bring their dogs down to take a walk in the morning, or they go down. URI students come from URI, they want to play disc golf and park there. And so, that it would be nice to see a couple of spots right at the end of the road there. Also, like if you want to go sledding or something, park and open up the tailgate, throw the kids out down the hill. This is, pretty big density increase for that section of South Road. So just want to be mindful of, what you're doing here. I think the new design that I saw tonight was a lot better, felt a lot more like an extension of the neighborhood of Teft Hill rather than something that was kind of, placed right at the bottom of it. So, but those are the main things that I want to come across. It's going to be a big impact to the neighborhoods on South Road. I'd like to see public parking. Thank you for taking into account some of the comments that I made earlier this year.
Thank you.
Good evening. Taylor Ellis from West Kingston, Marchon resident. This is a great opportunity for the town, and I'm glad that this town council and the other committees of the town are working to take advantage of this, because this is the first time that this town is actually talking about moving forward really on affordable housing. And the need is the need in the community, not what the state indicates. Yes, there's the 10%, there's the state law, but the need in our community is what should drive this. We're not trying to meet numbers to meet what the state law says. We're trying to meet the needs in our community. And there's been many people over the years who have left our community because they can't afford to live here. And so, yes, we have to think about the people living here, but we also have to keep in mind how things have changed in this town and how many people have left because they couldn't afford to stay here. There's so many things I have to say, and maybe I'll send you all like an email, and hopefully you'll read that. I'll try to get into some things in more depth. Many, and probably most of the people working in South Kingstown, in all of the shops and restaurants, and even in the schools and stuff, are probably making more like 50% AMI or 60%. Many of them are not reaching the 80% AMI. There's a huge need in our community and the surrounding communities for year-round rental housing. Year-round rental housing, we have very, very little. And especially targeting people in those lower incomes, 50-60% AMI. You can get the greatest bang for your buck by doing good quality rental housing. And if you set it all affordable, and if, let's say, the 50-60%, Pine View, it's just over the town line up in Exeter off of Route 2. You've probably driven by there. It's just over the line, about a half mile. There's 40 units of housing, rental housing that went in there at 50 and 60% AMI. It's set back, I think it's 10 quadruplexes, and I think it's a great thing that Exeter did, and we need to do something like that. And it can be done. That's on septic with well water, okay? And I would say I like the idea on the Oliver Watson House in the sense of what is the legacy there? It's serving extremely low-income, older workers. So low income is the legacy. the whole 55 plus, but the idea of doing a permanent supportive housing where you're serving people with disabilities. And disabilities are all different things with people. They can be many different ways, but there's a lot of people that need that kind of housing. There's a church across the street. There's people in the community that served on that board for years that made that happen until it was closed. So this is the kind of thing. Think about, you want the biggest bang for your buck. Don't try to do all these market rate units and throw in a little scatter of like a few 80 to 120. You're not serving the needs of the people. Why should we put subsidy, your effort, our effort, into serving people with higher than average incomes in our community, or 100 to 120, even the 80? There's so much need at lower. And I'd just like to say that there is that funding out there for that, and I'm sure you know more than I'm sure, even though I've worked in the affordable housing realm for 17 years, developing small projects and keeping them running over the years, and serving people that have been chronically hopeless, and seeing what you can do. It can be done. So think about getting the biggest bang for your buck. It's rental housing. It's the greatest need. Serve the people well lower than these upper regions. That's where you're going to get your subsidy. If you do a project that is at 50% and get some project-based housing vouchers and serve people at 30% and lower, you're going to get loads of subsidy from the state. That's the kind of project they're going to support. Like the kind of project that was talked about here is not going to get much support because it's just a little sprinkling of some 80 to 120% home ownership. That's not really meeting the needs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Doug Blaine. I live on 1105 South Road. I'm in a butter to South Road property. Jeremy, thank you for your revisions. I see you guys moving a few properties right off my side yard, which is very respectful. Appreciate that. A couple concerns I have about infrastructure. The South Road property has quite some heavy swales in the back corner. 1.5 million for sewer was thrown out there already. I think you're going to be probably 50% to 100% more than that. 7.5 to 10 million would be my guess, but I don't know. Just a guess. You guys are asking very specific questions about percentages of costs and things like that, and no fault to Eric. It's like asking somebody to give you the winning stock tickers. Nobody knows. You're really taking a gamble. So by the time you go to construction, I'm sure it's going to be up there. I guess that's kind of all I have. Jamie, thanks for bringing back the 3-bedroom. I think affordable is a workforce. There are people trying to support their families, and they need more than 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Josh Porter. Definitely want to co-sign on to the aiming lower if possible for our AMIs. But the one real point that I want to dive into more is to Mike, right, your point about parking. So when I'm looking at, especially Wakefield, but really all of these projects, like that for me is the elephant in the room, that the cost of road infrastructure and parking is sort of killing this on paper. Not to say that it's dead, but just it's really, really hurting it, right? So we're talking about mostly studios or one bedroom, maybe a couple of 2 bedrooms, for example, at Wakefield. And this is a place that is within walking distance, like right on the park there's a bus stop that can take you 1-seat ride to an Amtrak station. It can take you up to the airport. It can take you to Providence. You don't need to get up out of that seat. It will take you there for $2, right? You're right up on the bike path as well, so you can also commute by bike to wherever you might need to go. And this is also a place that's very, very close. Like we're talking about this as workforce housing, right? Like we're very, very close to a lot of businesses in the community. So in theory, a lot of these people could be working down there and could walk to work. Like they wouldn't need to specifically have cars. So it's sort of synergistic in that if you can get more units of housing there, it supports the businesses that are already in the community, or if we're building, mixed use, for example, that's also helpful. But it also allows us, we can get more people in there, for example, add another floor to the other building, that makes it a lot easier for it to pencil out on paper and at a lower AMI potentially, where we can potentially get access to additional funds. And also, sort of, again, synergistically, the lower you go, the less people are likely to have multiple vehicles to need to park anyway. It sort of just works out better. So I know that there are minimums that we need to work around. I don't know the extent to which we have any flexibility to work around those or waive those or what have you. But I really, from where I'm sitting, it seems like it's a huge impediment to making this project as good as it possibly can be. And I want to see us be as aggressive as we can at keeping those amounts of parking spaces low for the amount of units that we have, just to really make it work out. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Josh Gilman, Windmill Drive, so I'm right off of South Road. I wanted just to make a couple quick comments and remind the town council of some numbers. So 2023-24, URI put out that they're close to 1,000, if not higher, deficit in housing needs. So when we talk about AMI, those students who are there, whether we like it or not, fill that role. You build something, they're going to come. It might not serve the business community in other areas that you think it's going to serve from an AMI side, so just kind of keep that in your mind. The second is published just last Thursday, I think, a week from today, February 2025, average home sale, median home sale in South Kingstown, $750,000, up 22% year over year. So you start multiplying that, so shoveling ground, Debbie had said earlier, you're now at 800. Year after that, you're now almost 1 million. So keep that in mind, right? The slower this process is, the more that value increases. And I'm looking just at, South Road particularly. I think the Wakefield design is amazing. Love to see the commercial and the residential blend there. When I was looking at the numbers earlier, maybe we can just get some clarification. It was a $30 million all-in project, 44 units, I think, was kind of give or take in there. South Road. So if I just do straight line math there, that's about $681,000 per unit. Okay, so then again, shoveling grounds, and if we even fraction that it's not going to grow 22%, it's only going to grow 12. You're going from 680 to 763 to year 3 when we actually might break a ribbon or cut a ribbon, as somebody said. You're at the 855 mark. So again, when you start trying to adjust AMI and everything else in there, there's a big gap that the town's got to fill through either tax incentives or some other mean to make that happen. And finally, I just wanted to ask, has the town actually had the school buildings, so South Road and Wakefield, turned over to them yet, or are we still in limbo?
South Road, yes. Wakefield, no.
Is there any timeline on that?
Jim, you want to jump in on that one?
I've been here 3 years this month. I've been asking for it from day one. It has not been turned over yet. And it's in the process now being vandalized. Last Saturday, it's been vandalized, windows broken, paint thrown in it, graffiti. It's very important. It's very frustrating that the town has not had it at this point. So we're working on it.
Well, congratulations on your 3-year anniversary. That we haven't chased you out yet. But that I think for the town and really for everybody else here watching on TV, right, we're paying, and I think Mr. Mann, you had mentioned this to the Economic Development Committee a couple of months ago, that we're paying anywhere between $50 and $60 grand a year to keep those schools heated, cooled, whatever it might be, maintained. So again, multiply that by 3 years, I'm seeing real money going out the window, and hopefully we can get that turned over sooner than later. So if there's something I can do or the EDC can do to help you or the town council to get that property turned over quicker, let us know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Bill Fuller. I live at 1130 South Road. I'm Doug's neighbor. My house actually sits directly across the south entrance to the South Road School property. Thank you for the design changes. The greenway is very important. And I obviously you're taking community comment into account and very much appreciate that. The one thing I'm thinking about your designs, they look very pretty on paper. You know, the boxes are all nicely arranged, there's little circles for trees and so forth. But I'm wondering about the lot size for the 30 units that are being proposed currently on the South Road property. In my life, I have experience in living in a 2-bedroom, 1,000 square foot house. I have experience in living in a house that was on a 50 by 100 lot. So I have a great deal of understanding about the advantages and disadvantages, so we say, of small lot sizes. So what's the lot size? 40 by 100. Less than a tenth of an acre. So the folks, if the kitchen windows face the people preparing their dinners, will be able to see each other as they go through the process. And the last thing I'll say, I want to be quick. I appreciate the need for affordable housing. I'm a little bit concerned about how few affordable units are included in the plans. If you're going to go down this road of stacking house upon house to get the density, to get the price down. But I guess you guys do the numbers. The bigger issue is, referencing the previous person's comments, is the workforce people that you're really worried about, those who are firemen, policemen, teachers, municipal workers, the gap that they now face in being able to afford a market rate house is not going to change. It's going to increase. And if you build these houses in such a way where they can't stay in them for a lifetime, you're not doing them a favor. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I wanted to just talk about the lot size, because I know there are a number of developments in town that have a 10,000 square foot lot. One of them I'm pretty sure is Beach Street Place, which is over by the Y. And I think Vespia Lane has very small lots as well, so it's not something that's not done. And Vespia Lane is right by the police station, and it's maybe 3 to 5 years in progress, but Beach Street's been around for maybe 20 years. I don't know. It's right near you. So, I mean, they do show, there are smaller lots. I think there's an advantage to that as well. There's a community, but I hear what you're saying about concerns. But I think to make it work, like Jeremy's saying, we could build 6 houses, but it wouldn't even address there's just a huge need for everyone. If you follow social media, you hear all the time people looking for apartments, for housing. The landlord raised the rent, so we have to start somewhere and do something. And I think the advantage to using town property is there's less. We don't have to. We can absorb the acquisition in some way.
I just wanted to say that I think I was at one of the meetings here for the Oliver Watson public meeting. And I think either you said it or somebody else said it when they asked the state, what kind of affordable housing do we need? And they said all of it. I completely agree with you. We need more 1-year rentals, right? The 9-month rentals, and then Airbnb in it over the summer is destroying a lot of people's ability to stay and rent locally. Additionally, I understand the need for more 50% AMI to 80% AMI. But at the moment, there's lots of people that are making the 80 to 120% living in housing that should be priced for the 50 to 80, but there's just not enough housing, and that's pricing other people out. And I think that these projects, if done correctly, building on 80 to 120%, will allow people to get out of that housing, and people that have 50 to 80% for those prices go back down, so people can go live in those homes. I agree with Councilwoman Bergner that we have to start somewhere, but I do want to just thank everyone for coming out tonight, because all of your points have been well taken. It's good to see people that have been emailing about it in person, like Mr. Murphy, but yeah, just a few thoughts about that.
All right, anyone else in the audience wish to speak? All right, thank you all for your input. It's been a good meeting, and we look forward to what comes next here.